Let's take a look at installing our sleeves. There are a few methods for installing sleeves on garments, and we are going to utilize a method called setting in our sleeves, or a set-in sleeve. I'm gonna clean up some of my serge stitching here because it's in my way. But the first thing we want to do on these sleeves to set them in is to ensure we've got all of the necessary seams sewn. When we set in our sleeves, we are going to be sewing in the round. So we need to turn our sleeves into tubes, basically. We've already sewn the front and back bodice of our jacket together. So we already have a round armhole on either side. So shoulder seams and side seams should already be sewn to make a nice round armhole. Now we need to mimic that by sewing our sleeves into round tubes as well. This is the right side of my fabric, and I'm going to put my two underarm seams together, right sides together, matching up my seam allowance, matching up my raw edges. I'll pin this in place. Do you remember that here at the hem of your sleeves, the sleeve tapers in and then tapers back out? There's a little bit of a corner here. You don't have to necessarily pivot here. It's just a slight turn on your machine, but don't sew this straight down because remember it comes back out here a little bit. That allows us to turn our hems back when we finish this off. So underarm seams pinned together, right sides together. I'll do the same over here. Again, here's the right side of my fabric, right sides together, and I will pin these two seam allowances. You should have some notches, set of notches down here at the hem that you can match up, and there should be notches at the elbow. In this area here, this is where the wrist goes. This is the top of the arm. Bicep is in this area right here, and elbow is somewhere in the middle between the bicep and the wrist. If you've serged your work, you may not be able to find your elbow notches, but as long as these two seam allowances match up, you're fine. Okay, I'll take these two sleeves to the sewing machine. So at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end on a number 2 stitch. And once those are sewn, I will use my sleeve board to then press the seams open. So you can slide, hence the term sleeve board, you can slide your sleeves onto the sleeve board and easily press open your seams. So I've got both of my sleeves sewn together along my underarm seam. I placed my sleeves on my sleeve board so that I could press, just isolate this seam by itself, not worry about putting any creases or anything on the underside of the sleeve while pressing. And I press those seams open. I'm going to reach inside each of my sleeves, grab the wrist, and pull them right side out so I can no longer see my seam allowance. So sleeves right side out. And now we've got 2 tubes that should correspond slightly to the 2 armholes we sewed into our bodice. Take your bodice of your jacket that we sewed together previously and turn this inside out. So make sure you can see all the seams showing. So inside out, should be able to see all the seams and whatnot showing on the outside. And pick one of the armholes, either one. I'm gonna go with this one because I'm right-handed, so I'm gonna choose this one over here. And now I'm gonna pick one of my sleeves. Now, as I mentioned, there are a series of notches along the sleeve cap. There's one at the top. There's one that goes to the front of the sleeve, and 2 notches that correspond to the back of the sleeve. So the front of your sleeve goes towards the front of the bodice. The back of your sleeve goes towards the back of the bodice. And if it's not properly oriented in your sleeve, in your bodice or in the armhole, it can cause your sleeves to fly backwards rather than forwards on the body. They won't be tilted in the correct orientation. So I've picked a sleeve, and I'm going to take my sleeve right side out. Here's my sleeve cap. I can see the wrong side of my fabric here. I'm going to tuck this inside of my bodice. So I'm just reaching up underneath so that I can align the raw edges of my sleeve and my bodice. So I'll zoom in here a little bit. Here's my armhole in my bodice. And you can just shove the sleeve in through there. I'm just gonna reach underneath and pull the sleeve cap up through here. Now remember, this is the sleeve cap. The big side, the larger side of it. This is the wrist down here. It's teeny tiny at the wrist. We don't need to worry about that. This is my sleeve cap. There's my armhole. Just going to reach up underneath here and push the sleeve cap up into my armhole. Now, I'm going to zoom in here. Get some more light on there. Here is the side seam for my bodice. Here is the underarm seam from my sleeve. Those should match up. We're going to match those 2 seams. Now, it's a 50-50 shot whether I chose the right sleeve, because only one sleeve will match up with the notches that are already set into this armhole. I can tell you already that I have not chosen the right sleeve. I did that intentionally so you can see what happens when you choose the wrong sleeve. So I'm matching up these seams. Here's my seam from my bodice. Here's the seam inside of my sleeve. I'm gonna match up these raw edges. Here is my notch on my bodice, because my bodice is facing out, my sleeve is in here. Here's the single notch on my bodice, but I have 2 notches on my sleeve here. And you'll see if I go around here to the back of my bodice, there's 2 notches to the back of my bodice and only 1 notch on my sleeve. As I said, I chose the wrong sleeve intentionally so you can see what happens if you pick the wrong one. You'll find that your notches, as you get you go along this underarm curve, you'll find that the notches don't match. You'll have 1 notch and then a set of double notches. That means I've chosen the wrong sleeve for this armhole. I'm going to unpin it, set this aside. I'm going to use this later. That'll go to my other armhole. Again, it's a 50-50 shot. So if you don't get it the first time, and as long as you have patterned these properly and you've cut it properly and you've got all your notches, this is the only logical answer, is to get the other sleeve. Again, there's my armhole in my bodice, right inside out. Sleeve is right side out. And take my sleeve cap, reach up underneath, and put my sleeve cap into my armhole. There's my side seam from my bodice, and here is my underarm seam from my sleeve. I'm gonna place those right sides together, pin those in place, aligning the raw edges. And I'm going to pin both sides of this seam so I know that both seams stay open while I'm sewing. And now, if I follow along this underarm curve between my bodice and my sleeve, I've got 1 notch here on my bodice, and lo and behold, I've got a single notch here on my sleeve. So I can match up these notches. These don't quite line up, but I'm gonna make them, they're about 1/4 inch off, it's fine. I don't wanna add any fullness under the arm. These should be nice and flat. These 2 raw edges should be nice and flat. What's important is that you've got a single notch and a single notch. Whether they line up is negligible. So I'm going to pin this underarm curve until I get past that notch. I'm not really worried about what's going on under the arm here. And I'll go in the opposite direction, matching up the armhole of my bodice and the curve of my sleeve cap. And luckily I've got a double set of notches here on my bodice and a double set of notches on my sleeve. So I've got everything oriented correctly. I have the correct sleeve inserted in the correct armhole. I'll pin this together, and again, if the notches match up, if they line up, great. If they don't, it's okay. Okay. I've got the underarm pinned. My seams are nice and flat on both the inside, on the bodice and the sleeve, and my underarms are pinned until we get to those notches. I'm gonna go up here to the top of my sleeve cap. Here's the top of my sleeve cap, right here. Here's that single notch I mentioned. That aligns to your shoulder seam. Here's the shoulder seam on my bodice. I'm gonna place these right sides together, matching up this notch to that shoulder seam. So there's the notch. There's my shoulder seam. I'm gonna pin that. I'm just gonna put a single pin in there for right now. And I want to avoid pinning. I just want to make sure my pin doesn't go through any of these E-stitches that I have here, because now, if you look at your sleeve, you're gonna find your armhole and your sleeve are not the same size. We have a similar issue to what we had when we were sewing the shoulder seams, where our sleeve cap is now too big. It's kind of flopping around. It's too big for our armhole. And we're going to use those E-stitches just like we did on the sleeve. I'm going to, on the shoulder seam, excuse me. I'm going to grab, got to find both of my tails here. One is tucked in here. There we go. And I'm going to anchor these onto one of my pins. Again, I like to anchor this one over on the left-hand side because I'm right-handed, so I'm going to be pulling from this side. If you're left-handed, you may want to anchor this side so you can pull from the left side. I'm just going to put my threads underneath the pin here and anchor those threads temporarily. And then from this opposite side, I can grab one of my ease tails, doesn't matter which one, I've got two. I'm just going to pick one of them. And again, holding this taut, I'm going to slide my fabric along those ease stitches. You can see it's starting to gather up. I'm going to try to slide it past my pin. If you find it difficult to slide it past the pin, you can take this pin out and then repin it later. And just like I did before, I'm going to gather up more than I need to, and then I will smooth these gathers back out until it fits my armhole. So while these are referred to as ease stitches because we are easing our garment in, you can use the exact same kinds of stitches for when you want to make gathers, like ruffles and things like that. It's the exact same stitch. Now I can see, again, I've got my shoulder notch pinned at my sleeve cap notch pinned at my shoulder seam. So this doesn't need to go anywhere. If you've removed this pin to gather everything up, replace it just to make sure your notch is aligned to the shoulder seam. And now we've got a similar issue where I've got too many gathers here on my sleeve and my armhole is now too big. So I'm going to start smoothing this back out. Again, our ease stitches are just to bring one curve in or one seam in to fit another. It shouldn't have any puckers. When you're using a stitch like this for gathers, however, you're going to stitch right over this. You want all the puckering and the gathering and whatnot, but in the instance of working on these sleeves, I do not want these puckers or gathers, so I'm going to smooth them back out as best I can. And every so often I'm going to kind of tug at these to make sure that my raw edges are matching up. I'm going to take a little bit more out, just a smidge. Kind of ease this back out. a little tug. So again, just a very slight little ripples in there. And I just want to distribute these a little bit more evenly. And I'll pin these into place just so I know where that ease has been distributed. Now, again, you'll see a lot of ripples and buckles along the edge of the seam allowance here, but right here at our E-stitching, and remember we made our E-stitches at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So right here, about 1/8 of an inch away where I'm going to be sewing, I really shouldn't see anything gathered up on itself. I shouldn't see any of my fabric looking like it wants to fold onto itself, because I don't want any puckers when I sew this sleeve together. Now, depending on the fabric that you've chosen, you might find that puckers become very difficult to remove. Thicker, heavier fabrics tend to smooth out a little bit better when installing sleeves, but those also tend to cost more money. So just be very careful when you're sewing this, and I'll show you when I sew on the machine how I try to avoid any puckers or gathers. All right, now I've got the other half to deal with. I got through the back side of it, and I'm going to deal with the front. And again, just kind of loosening up these ease stitches, kind of, and if you need to, you can gather them back up. If you find that your sleeve cap suddenly becomes too big, you can gather it back up. I think this one's a little too big. I need to pull these ease stitches again, redistribute this. I'm going to kind of give it a tug. I think that's enough ease. I'm going to go ahead and lock my thread around my pin here, if I can find the other side of my pin, just so that doesn't go anywhere. And now I just need to distribute this and pin. Set-in sleeves take time, but it gives you a very nice tailored finish to your garments. And this is the method, especially when you're working with tailored sleeves that have a very tall sleeve cap. I gotta gather it in again. You're going to end up with a lot of little pins, and you are welcome to try to sew this with all the pins intact. I do not do that. I will replace my pins with basting stitches, hand sewn basting stitches, because basting stitches don't get in my way when I'm sewing like pins do. And a temporary set of basting stitches can really help in ensuring that the puckers and things that might happen on the sewing machine are less likely to happen, because our basting stitches act as a temporary seam, and they're much more secure than the pins are. They behave like a machine stitch, just a little bit looser. Okay. I've got a little bit more finagling to do just to make sure I don't get any puckers or gathers. For example, here, like this could become a pucker. If this kind of folded over on itself in the sewing machine and I stitched over it, it would cause a pucker on the outside of my garment. So this is something that I would kind of smooth over, kind of redistribute this fullness in either direction and try to smooth that out. So again, you can see there's a lot of ripples right here around the edge, but right where you should be sewing should be relatively smooth. So much so that after we sew it on the machine and press it on the ironing board, you shouldn't see any issues. I'm gonna grab some thread here and I will hand baste this in place. And I'm just going to take some relatively small stitches I like to baste my seams at a larger seam allowance. So I know I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I will baste this at about 5/8 of an inch. So about 1/8 of an inch larger than the 1/2 inch seam allowance that we have. Because I know that if I can keep my fabric nice and smooth at 5/8 of an inch, I should be able to keep it smooth at 1/2 an inch. Again, I'm using my basting stitches. I'm using my basting stitches as a kind of a gatekeeper from puckers. Keep those puckers outside of my seam allowance, somewhere out here in the garment, so that I don't have to worry about them getting in the way of my needle when I go to sew. And keep this anchor pin in place just in case my ease stitches want to fly away on me. And as I mentioned, we're going to be sewing in the round, so that's exactly what I'm doing with my hand basting. I'm just sewing around the circle, starting at the underarm seam where I know my seams are nice and flat. I don't have to worry about the easing under there. Seam allowances aren't quite matched up here. Okay, coming back around to where I started, make sure my seams are still open underneath there. I'll just take one extra stitch just to kind of reinforce. I'm not putting a knot or anything, just taking a few little stitches in the same place. Cut my basting thread. And I feel pretty confident I'm going to remove these pins that have my ease stitches kind of holding in place. I'll get those out of the way because I don't want to stitch over those. Okay, so when I get to the sewing machine, I'm just going to have to be very, very diligent as I go around this curve to make sure I don't get any puckers or gathers as I sew this in. But this is basted and ready to go. As you can see, it's in the round. Everything's installed in there. Everything's hand basted into place. And I will repeat the process on my other sleeve just so you can see that again. Now, when you pull everything right side out, you might see a couple of puckers and things like that, but that's because it's just a hand-basted stitch holding it in place. But you can start to see how our sleeve will install onto the bodice of our jacket. There's the top of my sleeve there. So once again, bodice inside out with my armhole in here. Sleeve right side out, so I can't see my seam allowance. Sleeve cap, the big wide side of it. Slide that in here so that my side seam on my bodice matches the underseam on my sleeve. Put those right sides together, matching up my seam allowance, my raw edges. Pin that in place. Now, if you have properly patterned your fabric, properly copied the patterns, and you've made sure you had a mirrored pair of your sleeves, but you come to install one of your sleeves and it doesn't fit, meaning the notches don't correspond, then you've probably sewn your sleeve inside out. So you may just need to, if you've got a type of fabric that looks the same from right side and wrong side, and you go into there and you're like, it doesn't fit I've got corresponding 2 notches here and 2 notches on the bodice. But if you get the first one in and it works fine, and then you come to your second one and the notches aren't corresponding, more than likely you've sewn your sleeve inside out. So you have to remove it, remove the underarm seam, turn it the opposite direction, and sew it again, and then try to reinstall it into the armhole. Again, if your notches do not exactly line up, it's okay, so long as the orientation of them is correct. That's most important. I'll find my ease tails here and get them locked down onto this pin. Set that aside for right now because I'll need it later. So I've got underarm pinned. I've got my matching notches pinned. I'm gonna work my way around this curve and pin my notch on my sleeve cap to my shoulder seam. Again, I have my fabric right sides together. And I've already locked down my ease tails over here. Just gonna find my other 2, and grabbing one of them, I will start to gather up this sleeve cap. That might be enough for right now. I'll try to smooth this back out, distribute this fullness so it's not all gathered in one place. Start to pin this. Just make sure when you are easing these sleeves in that your raw edges stay aligned. You shouldn't have one seam allowance 1/4 inch longer than the other, because then your sleeves are going to be going in all kinds of wonky. Okay, pinned in place. I'm gonna baste it down. Again, I'll be basting at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm just eyeballing 5/8 of an inch. But if you feel that you need to mark your fabric, you can. Or use a ruler, that's fine. Keep my anchor pins in place, just in case. Okay, coming around full circle, done with the second sleeve. Just gonna give this a little bit of a tug, make sure my hand basting stitches aren't gathering up my fabric too much. You may notice when you're sewing, when you're doing hand basting stitches, that your fabric kind of gathers up. Just as I mentioned, that's machine, number 4 stitches on the machine can be used as E-stitches. They can also be used to gather up your fabric. If you want to use them as gathering stitches, you can. You can also use hand basting stitches for gathering up your fabric as well. I don't recommend using hand basting stitches for easing your work, but it can be used to make gathers. And again, you can kind of take a look on the outside and see how our sleeve is about to look when it's installed. But because I've stitched this, hand stitched this at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, the sleeves are a little bit short right now, so they're going to be a little bit short. But these are eased in and basted into place, and I will go to the machine and sew everything in place at a 1/2 inch seam allowance on a number 2 stitch. When I go to sew, I'm going to be working from the sleeve side up. I want to be able to see what's going on with all of these ease stitches and whatnot. I want to make sure that nothing gets too out of hand while I'm sewing, so I don't get any puckers. So I'll be sewing from the sleeve side up when I'm on my machine. I will start with one armhole and continue with the second. Again, this is my sleeve side where all my E-stitches are, and I will start with the underarm. I'm going to start down here where my seam is for my underarm and the side seam of my bodice. I'm going to kind of reach up in here and just grow accustomed. Again, if you need to mark your seam allowance, do. We're sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, number 2 stitch. You'll see me do this a little bit as I'm sewing. It's because I'm either smoothing out the fabric or I'm feeling a pucker or something underneath. So get into the habit of feeling your fabric before it travels into your needle, because you might feel a pucker about to happen before it happens, and then you can preemptively prevent that from happening. So I'm going to start at this underarm seam, back tack at the beginning just to anchor my stitches. You don't have to do too much back tacking because we're going to work in the round and we're going to overlap those stitches. These seams should be relatively flat. You'll see me check my fabric underneath, again, looking for puckers, but I'm also, you notice I pinch my fabric like this. My thumb is under here for a reason, because I'm feeling if anything's about to happen, if I'm about to grab a pin or a pucker or something weird. But I'm also doing this. You're going to see me kind of scraping at my fabric. It's because I can feel some kind of fullness under here, and I'm trying to get it out of the way of my needle before it catches. I can feel something going on under here. I'm just going to smooth that out of the way so it doesn't get in the way of my needle. Like, I don't care what happens to my fabric over here or over here. As long as it doesn't get caught under my needle, I'm fine. This isn't quite matched up, so let me match up these seam allowances. Go. Now, you'll see that I've got a little bit of a pucker about to happen here. If I zoom in, you'll see this pucker right here. I'm going to do my best to kind of smooth this out before it gets to my needle. And this is why I tend to have my awl. My needle is down. I want to lift this just to make sure that this gets smoothed out as best I can. That's better. Okay. Here's another potential pucker right here. Again, I'll kind of pick at it a little bit, making sure my needle's down before I lift my foot. Just kind of smooth that out, poke at it a little bit. That might have been a pucker right there. Couldn't quite catch it before my needle went over it. But I'll take a look at it in just a second, see if I can smooth it out. Again, I'm going to kind of distribute this ease. Checking underneath, make sure there's nothing wonky going on under there. Smooth that out. That could be a pucker there. Now remember, a lot of these quote-unquote potential puckers can be smoothed out with a good pressing. Some of them are a little too far gone, but some of them can be salvaged by just pressing. I've got something back here. Right there. That could be a problem. I'm probably going to redo that little section there, because that's gonna cause me issues when I turn my work right side out. Again, make sure your needle is down when you go to lift up your foot, otherwise your stitches are going to go all over the place. Okay, getting near the worst of it, getting near the better part. The worst of it, I think, is over. Just going over that sleeve cap with all those E-stitches. That's where it gets really hairy. But under here at the underarm, it's pretty smooth sailing. And as I come back to where I left off, I'll just overlap my stitches. Clip my threads. I know I got a lot of threads hanging around here. Okay, let's take a look at that potential pucker. So for example, this isn't too bad. That's fine. That's something that will press out. Even this will probably press out right here. Not a problem. This one, not so much. This one will probably need to be resewn. That's not likely to press out on its own. But this one over here, this one I definitely want to resew. And that's just a case of taking a few stitches out before and after it. Again, this is a internal seam. You can always just rip out little sections of your internal seam and resew that little section. Do not go and resew the entire seam. No sense in doing that. Put my work back in. There's that little section I just removed. I'm just going to overlap my stitches before and after. No need to back tack, just going to overlap. And I'll kind of smooth this out. Hopefully I won't make the same mistake again, but maybe I do. We'll see. Better? Yeah, there we go. That's much better, much smoother. I'll just overlap my stitches here. Okay. I'm not too concerned about that one right there. These are fine. These should press out. But this one here, I'm going to turn this right side out and take a look at this section. It's near the back. I've got my double notches here, so it's near the back of my bodice. I'm just going to kind of pinch this and turn this right side out to see how this is looking. Oh, my basting stitches are in the way, so I'm not going to know until I take those out. Let me go ahead and take those few out. This one I'm worried about. So right here, that's the trouble spot right there. If I turn this right side out, yeah, I might resew that one. I feel like it can kind of press out. You can kind of smooth your fabric out in either direction to kind of see what an iron would do. It's negligible. It's a teeny tiny thing, but if I have the time, I may go back and resew that one. But let me go ahead and sew the other sleeve into place so you can see that sewing in the round one more time. And then I'll take the time to go back and repair any little puckers I might have. Couple of back stitches just to secure my thread, and I'm off. Feeling underneath, smoothing out my fabric. Okay, this one I feel went a little bit better than the other. That wasn't nearly as challenging as, of course, I probably just jinxed myself, but you may also notice that I'm trying to stitch to the left of my E-stitches because I don't want to have to take these stitches out. So I'm trying to keep my sewing to the left of my original E-stitches on my sleeve cap because I don't want to take those E-stitches out. I'm lazy. Coming back around to where I started, and I will overlap my stitches to secure them. And I'll take a gander at how that went, see if I have any puckers to have to deal with. But that felt like it went much smoother than the other sleeve. Yeah, that one's much better. Not nearly as many things to have to repair. Going to fix this little pucker back here on my other sleeve, the first one I sewed. Just took some stitches out, and I've try and smooth this stitching out. Smooth this ease out so it doesn't cause a pucker again. Just trying. Better. Okay. And overlap these stitches, and done. That should be enough. And our sleeve should be set in. Okay, I'm just going to clean up some of my threads. I've got lots of little threads. We've got those E-stitch tails that we can get rid of. If you're satisfied with how that has set in, you can get rid of all those E-stitch tails. As I mentioned at the machine, I'm not taking out my E-stitches because I don't have time for all that and nobody's going to see it, so I'm not going to worry about it. If this were a fully lined garment, you certainly would not take those E-stitches out because the lining would cover up everything. But in the interest of time and the fact that this is just a sample, no need to have to take all those E-stitches out. But any thread tails that are left, I'm going to clip those. And I will remove my basting stitches. Okay, moment of truth. Turn this right side out, see if we got any really bad gaps or puckers or anything going on. And if you do, again, you can go in and just remove a couple of stitches and re-sew them, overlapping your stitches. So you can see it's a little bit of fullness, a little bit of puckering and whatnot, but nothing that has the fabric like overlapping itself and causing a huge issue. A lot of this can be pressed out. As this is, you know, we've gathered in, and you can kind of see, hopefully if I hold it in this direction, you kind of see that little bit of roundness that gets produced up here at the sleeve cap. That's that roundness that happens from easing our stitches in and produce a little bit of a ball for us to fit the ball of the shoulder right here. And because it is a curved seam and we've created some fullness, we created some shape here, you can use your tailor's hand to press these seams. I recommend pressing your seams in the same direction. Do not try to press this seam open. It's not worth your time. Press both seam allowances. Here's the inside of the jacket. Press all your seam allowances in one direction. Either press them all towards the body of the jacket. You can press the sleeve cap towards the body. You can let the seam allowance kind of push in different directions. You can see here, here's the jacket itself around the outer edge here, and here's the sleeve inside of here. I can push this seam allowance, both seam allowances up and out towards the body of the jacket, towards the bodice, and then I can press this seam allowance up towards the sleeve. But let me show you really quickly so you can kind of get an idea of this. It's up to you which direction you want to press it. I'm gonna grab my tailor's hand and set this inside, just the tip of it right here near that ball of that shoulder. If I push all of my seam allowance towards the body of my jacket, so right now both seam allowances are going in this direction towards the jacket itself. Here's the sleeve on this side. It creates a fairly smooth transition between the body of the jacket and the sleeve right here on this seam. You can see it's a fairly smooth transition. Now, if I reach up underneath and I push all the seam allowance towards the sleeve in the opposite direction and kind of pull this over this tailor's hand, pushing all the seam allowance. Now all the seam allowance is going towards the sleeve, I think. There we go. You'll notice it creates a very different kind of shape, where now suddenly here's the body of my jacket and I've got this little bump that gets produced at the sleeve cap. It's entirely up to you what kind of finish you prefer. Some designers will add that little bit of a ridge, that little hump right here, and depending on the type of fabric you're using, this little bump may be more or less pronounced. Some folks prefer to press everything towards the bodice so that it's a much smoother transition. And again, with some fabrics, you may see the fabric kind of come down and tuck in ever so slightly right underneath here where that seam is, and then the sleeve comes back out. I tend to press everything towards the bodice, but it's totally up to you. So I do recommend using your tailor's hand inside. Just kind of place this upright on your ironing board, place your sleeve on top, determine whether you want to push all your seam allowance towards the bodice, the body of the jacket, or towards the sleeve, and just kind of hit it with a little bit of steam. If you're gonna press it, try not to crush this down with your iron. Just hover the iron on top, press the steam button once, just hold it, let the steam escape from the iron, and then maybe just kind of lightly tap it with your iron just to kind of get those little puckers and whatnot out, get everything situated where you'd like it to be. Got some weird stitches showing up here. What are these? Oh, I know what that is. That's leftover. That's when I took those stitches out. That's leftover. Okay. Okay. So, determine which direction you'd like to press your seam allowance. You can also go in and serge both together, both seam allowances together if you'd like. I'm not going to require you all to clean finish these seams, but again, don't try to press them open. It's going to take too much time and it doesn't look very good. But do press them in one direction or the other, towards the sleeve or towards the bodice, and you can clean finish these by serging them or bias binding around both seam allowances if you wish.